Donut immediately sees herself as Mongo's parent, the self-centered narcissist, supposedly, who does care about people, but is still going to react in a narcissistic way to a lot of things, has the opportunity to grow and love and love something that is not necessarily going to, like, Mongo does love her back. I think that's demonstrated, but Mongo is also a velociraptor. So Mongo is not going to express love in the way that Donut is probably used to receiving praise. But that is an opportunity for Donut to be a hero in a way that she was not before. Like, she has the opportunity to demonstrate love, to grow as a character, and also have a kick-ass velociraptor. Hey, how's it going? I'm James, and I am having a terrible writing week. So today we're going to talk about Dungeon Crawler Carl and some of the things that I think work really well in this book as a first in series, as a portal fantasy, or really a portal into lit RPG and the genre, and as a character-driven, action-driven story that has a lot of room to expand as the series continues. So if you aren't familiar with Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman, this book was first published, I want to say around 2021, and it started as a serial on Royal Road. Serial means that typically the writer will have sometimes finished the whole book and then started posting it, but a lot of times the writer is like writing and posting as they're writing the book. Some of the tropes that are on Royal Road is that it's often, it's the stories and lit RPG in general are stories and world building based on games, game mechanics. They often have a lot of charts that turns people off sometimes because a big part of the story will be items and monsters and characters that all have stats, just like in a video game, a role-playing game in particular. But they could have side quests where the character just goes off and does something and then comes back to the main story. Typically, every weekly chapter is going to be between 2,000 and 3,000 words, and they can just go on for a long time. But that's one of the tropes of the genre. That's what readers expect. Well, I think that Dungeon Crawler Carl in particular has done a really good job of bridging audiences between what is a really niche audience with niche expectations in lit RPG and Dungeon Crawler Carl to the broader general audience that is initially a fantasy audience, but I would actually call this book much more science fiction than fantasy. Dungeon Crawler Carl opens seeming like it's a portal fantasy, but as things progress and the world starts to make more sense, it really, really becomes science fiction. And I think that this book owes a lot to, I shouldn't say but this book is very similar to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the way that series opens, the tone, the ideas, and the general sense of like humor, but also there is an elevated thread running through this book of like, it's got very important themes that work within it, and everything is kind of serving the themes. So let's talk about, just right off the bat, what is a portal fantasy? Or in lit RPG, it's often called isekai. So a portal fantasy is where a character from our world is pulled out of their everyday life and transported into a fantasy world. And they have to, like, part of the trope is making sense of the world and how that world works. It gives the author an opportunity to explain world building using terms and character concepts that people already know. You don't have to go into it like Tolkien and come up with a whole background language to explain how culture works and, how the world works and things like that. It doesn't have to be like, a lot of fantasy is just based on our world in the Middle Ages, but there is other fantasy that is incredibly detailed to create a different type of world. And the author has to do double duty, and the characters have to do double duty, explaining how that world works or living in that world in a way that makes it feel real to the reader. And that's one of the things that readers come to that genre for, or, really fantasy and science fiction in general. So isekai, and I am not an expert in this, so I may butcher something, but isekai comes from manga and is a very similar concept, but has some other tropes that typically you have what could be thought of as like a loser or a person who's not making it in regular everyday life, who gets transported into a fantasy world, often at level 0 in the game. And the idea is that they progress and build their way up and become, a hero in the game. And both of these give, obviously the main character that is transported, it's kind of built in that they're the hero. But isekai, even more than a lot of fantasy, there is a progression trope where the character is going to start at a low level and progress upwards as the story continues. And so one of the things that the author has to balance is how fast are they going to progress? How does the world change in relation to their progression? Because just like a video game, there are certain satisfying things about becoming overpowered and becoming kind of a god in the game. That's part of what draws people into gaming. But as anybody who's played that way knows, or played a game where you could basically switch it to God mode and nobody can kill you, it gets boring pretty fast. So that is harder to balance than I think a lot of people realize. So that's a big aspect of how this works. Let me get rid of this. And then another thing that works really well, and I just want to throw this out there to start with, and then we'll dig into, is this is a genre story. It is initially action driven, but I would also argue that it's very character driven. And part of what continues to pull you through the story and what powers the story is the characters. But there's something that I think I first learned about this from F. Scott Fitzgerald. But the idea that action is character. And so a lot of people will say that, everything in a story should do double duty. The way I interpret that is everything about the story is contributing to character, and character is what keeps your reader reading the story. They want to love the character. They want to follow the character. They want to be intrigued or, interested in, or just that's a person they want to get to know. And once they know them, they want to stay with them. That's really what, once everything is firing on all cylinders and a series is successful, people will read that character reading the phone book, and they'll laugh about this, but that really is when the author is just, everything is successful. But there's a lot of work, I think, that goes into making that, starting that engine in the first place. And Dungeon Crawler Carl does a really good job of that. Everything about the character Carl, the way he responds to situations, the way that he interacts with the world and tries to solve problems and gathers information, all contribute to who he is as a character. And then also the way that other characters respond to the world tells you, without them even saying, things that you need to know about them. So if you should feel good or bad about them. And I shouldn't even say good or bad, because I think one of the things this series does, and Dinniman does really well, is that there are very few purely good or bad characters. So okay, starting out there, I think this is a thing that the series does very well. But from the beginning, if we talk about the inciting incident, I think everybody knows Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and basically aliens show up and they've decided that the Earth is in the way of a highway, a super space highway, and it's going to be demolished. And so our main character has to make a decision about, is he going to stay on the Earth or leave the Earth? Well, Dungeon Crawler Carl opens with a very similar situation where it turns out the Earth has been part of this video game, or I shouldn't call it a video game, part of a game. I think if we think of it more in terms of the Hunger Games, it is even broader for folks that don't like video games. But the Earth is caught up in this. Basically, Carl is awake at 3 a.m. because his cat, or 2 a.m. actually, because his girlfriend's cat has left the apartment. It's snowing outside, and he is already demonstrating character by going outside to try and get Donut, the cat, back inside the house. And the way the situation is set up is that he goes outside wearing some of his girlfriend's shoes that don't fit, wearing Crocs, and a t-shirt and his boxers, because he responds quickly and he's really trying to solve the problem in the moment. He probably could have thought this through better. He probably could have put shoes on. He probably could have thrown a jacket on because he knows it's snowy outside. But Carl is a person who jumps in and tries to help people without always thinking through everything. He gets better at this, but from the very beginning, from the very first like the first opening sequence and scene, this is what is happening. And the very first line of the book does say that, I think it says the earth ended at 2 a.m. So like from the very beginning, it's hooking the reader that something bad happens and characters are responding to that. Like it could have started with, Carl was a guy that lived in Seattle that had been in the Coast Guard and felt like he was drifting through life. And, things got strange when the world seemed to end at 2 a.m. Like, no, it like jumps right. It doesn't jump into media res. Like it's not like in the middle of an action sequence, but it is in a thing forcing the character to make a decision. And so we get to see the character making a decision. One thing that can frustrate readers, I think, is if a character really equivocates on making a decision and then doesn't act on it once they do make the decision, or putting that decision at the end of a chapter break, which could be a way to lead or pull people into the next chapter, but can also frustrate readers if it happens a lot. Well, Carl is making and acting on decisions right from the beginning. And something that I also think this series does well when we look at, engines that drive character, is that the story is always giving a choice between two relatively equal decisions. Relatively equal outcomes or options. And I'll get into this more when we get into the idea of loot boxes, but from the very beginning, Carl is making a choice and dealing with the consequences of that choice. So let's talk about the characters and how the characters work. We have Carl, who is already demonstrating that he is dependable. He cares about people. He is a person with a certain amount of agency. He has physical strength. He's not a character that is held down by a lot of, other things that could create conflict for characters. Almost all the conflict in this story, and there is internal conflict, like Carl does have an internal narrative that he's dealing with, and I don't want to get too deep into that because there's some spoilers for him, but most of the conflict is external. And this works. Like a lot of times I think if writers have come from literary fiction, and I say that because I also kind of struggled with this moving to science fiction, is readers don't always come to science fiction and fantasy or, entertainment type genre fiction because they want to read about a really angsty character. They want to read about, they do want characters to be real, and they want characters to have things they're working through, but they want characters to be responding to problems outside of themselves and doing it in a way that feels as realistic as the situation allows. Obviously, these are fantastical situations, which probably would not happen in real life, but that's part of the appeal of reading the story, right? While there is conflict between characters, the conflict is not central and it's not bogging down the story. The characters don't spend a lot of time on this sort of angsty back and forth, and as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about examples like, Romantasy, like The Fourth Wing was just full of this internal angst. But I think that's more a trope of romance and the will they, won't they, that's part of that, which for me, I just really didn't enjoy it, but that's part of that that subgenre. So maybe take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But for the things that I like to read, at least, or I think what's working in this story, most of the conflict is external, but the characters are always pushing on each other in entertaining ways. And almost no character is ever alone on the stage in this series. So what I mean by that is we have Carl in a situation dealing with a problem. We've set up Carl as a character from the very first paragraph of this book, but Carl is not alone. Carl is responding to a fluffy show cat named Donut, who is making Carl's life difficult and already giving information about Carl because it's his girlfriend's cat. His girlfriend is on a trip to the Bahamas. He thinks his girlfriend could be cheating on him, but he's not really dwelling on it. He's just trying to solve the problem of, I need to get the cat back inside. And there's a subtext here that he cares about the cat. He won't come out right out and say he loves the cat, but he cares about the cat. And so the cat is pushing on Carl's character and forcing him into action and making him do things and making him make decisions. And then when the first really big decision happens in this world, it seems like it's a choice between two sort of equal things. So it's not a spoiler to say that, like, basically what happens, and this is from the very beginning part of the ticking time bomb of the series, and I'll get to ticking time bomb in a second, but every structure on the planet is crushed. And so anybody that was inside a structure is killed. So there's tragedy. It depends on the time zone you were in. Like in the US, we lose a lot of people because it's happening at 2 a.m. in the morning. But then in Europe, it happened, in the middle of the day for a lot of those characters. But still, people were indoors. And so those people are pulled out of the story. And basically, giant words are broadcast in the sky saying that, welcome to the latest iteration of the dungeon. And the dungeon is a game that you don't know a lot about it yet. But the character has to make a decision. Do they want to stay on the surface of the earth and try to survive? Or do they want to enter the nearest stairwell and start playing the game? Now, Dinniman sets this up because this is happening in Seattle and it's snowing outside. There's a lot of reasons that Carl does not want to stay on the surface. He's not dressed for it. And that could generally be a bad idea. But there is a story here, and we touch on some of these characters later, where maybe the resistance decides to stay on the surface of the earth, and we're going to fight the aliens without going into their game at all. Like, nah, screw their game. We're not going to do that. But Carl has enough things weighing on either side that he chooses to go into a stairwell, also because the stairwell seems warm. There's not as much information about the game being bad. But that decision from the very beginning, like there's kind of two ways this story could go, and both of them are kind of interesting, right? But he does go down the stairwell with Donut, and the game begins. So it's not readily apparent that the way the world building is going to work is that the aliens have basically, while they've crushed everything on the earth, they have subsumed everything on the earth. They have taken all the people that were killed, all of the structures, the pop culture, everything that was there, and they've turned that into the game or aspects of the game. And that becomes more clear as the story progresses, but that gives the reader something to hang on to. So again, the world building is science fictional and futuristic in a way, but also very relatable in another way. And it sets up a mystery of trying to figure out how these things are being used to, manipulate the characters. But getting back to Carl not being alone. So from the beginning, Carl is a guy that he could strike off on his own and try to conquer this situation on his own. But he's demonstrating through his action that he cares about the cat. And some people who don't like cats will be like, leave the cat. But I like animals in general. Like, to me, in any given story, if a character hurts an animal, that's immediately like minus 1,000 for that character. Like, it's going to take a lot for me to come back on that character. And so while you might not like cats, he's still demonstrating that he cares about things, and I shouldn't say things, about animals and things outside himself. So he leaves the surface, very quickly finds himself in sort of a fantasy setting. And again, the very beginning, I mean, the title of the book is Dungeon Crawler Carl. So it's setting up this idea that we're going to be caught up in a D&D game, Dungeons and Dragons, which is another sort of like soft entry point into this of setting up reader expectations, which then very quickly the book starts to subvert in the way that it works. But they get pulled into the game, they respond to some things in the game in the best way they can, and then they find themselves in a room with another character named Mordecai. And so character triangles are something that this book does a lot of. And when we think of, or this series does a lot of, and Dinniman does really well, I think, because his other series that I've read, or book, I guess, Kaiju Battlefield Surgeon, it's got a lot of words in the title, does some similar things. That book has a lot of like very serious body horror. So if that's not your thing, I would not recommend that book, but it is still an interesting game world mechanic kind of book. But a character triangle is, we can have, like, as soon as we have one character that we like, as a writer, it can be hard to just come up with stuff internally and externally to keep that character busy. This is especially difficult in first person, where when you think about trying to write 300,000 words from a single POV, where you can't move around to different characters, you can't show different things about the story from different characters' points of view, you're really locked into one character's opinions and level of understanding of a given situation. That can be hard. It is hard. I have a hard time doing it. I've done it, but it's actually not my favorite way to write. So, but as soon as you have a character in a situation, if you can introduce another character who is responding to the same situation with them and potentially doing things that character may or may not like, or are pushing them on a way, or one character could be the straight up, straight-laced person, and the other one is more of a free-flowing, go with the wind kind of character that's going to make brash decisions, which then forces the other character to make decisions. That will drive the story forward, and readers really enjoy that. They don't want to read about those characters bickering, in my experience. They're fine with characters having different points of view and different ways of responding to a situation. Like, this gets to like the Dungeons and Dragons setup of being story driven with different characters responding to a problem in a different way, but they're still essentially a team pulling in the same direction. And that's where, while they might frustrate us in certain ways, we're still satisfied with them because they're moving forward. So Carl has this cat. He ends up in a situation with a third character named Mordecai, who we don't know a lot about Mordecai, but Mordecai does very quickly explain that he is a game guide, and he is there to help players navigate the game and figure out how things work so they can play the dungeon. And he becomes a stand-in for world building and explaining to a certain extent how the world works, and as much as he can give to the character at the level they are. But he also, this is a bit of a spoiler, but I think everybody knows this happens, Donut basically gets a cookie that makes Donut intelligent, sentient. And when Donut becomes like a fully fledged character, Donut is still a cat with all of the constraints and strengths of being a cat, but Donut is still a show cat. And so Donut, like, it becomes very, like, as we start falling into sort of Dungeons and Dragons tropes, like Carl is obviously, a brawler, why as soon as I think of the concept, the word escapes me. He's there as the warrior, the fighter, and he's still an intelligent character, but Donut is absolutely the high charisma, low strength bard character who is going to make brash decisions because it's like the thing that appeals to her vanity or the thing that seems like the most fun to do. And then Carl has to react to that. And Mordecai is much more, he knows the world, he knows what's at stake, and he's explaining as much of it as he can to these characters who become his friends, but he's also represents kind of a mystery at the beginning. But by setting up these three characters, now you don't, with a character triangle in a binary of two characters, you've just got two people back and forth. But with three, now we've got a bit of a love triangle going on. I mean, now you got some meat in the stew, right? And there's a reason that so many love stories like do the love triangle from the very beginning. Like, it's such a foundational trope of romance, but it works in so many other places. As soon as you have a character having to make a decision between three equally interesting things, that gives readers like no, I'm on team Jacob or whatever from Twilight, or no, I'm on team, I don't remember the vampire's name. But you can see how they're like, this gives readers something to chew on. There's some meat on the bone. And while Mordecai is not a love interest in any way, he does set up like back and forth between Carl and Donut. And he also gives Carl and Donut something to try and figure out as they're out in, out of the safe room, responding to the world and the problems in the world. And so it doesn't stop with just Mordecai. Like, Mordecai is an ongoing part of that, like, long-standing triangle, but then they are constantly coming into contact with other characters from our world who are playing the game. And early on, Carl makes a decision that he's going to try and help everyone survive as much as he can. That becomes like foundational to his character, and it helps drive a lot of his decisions. And so that's kind of set up from the very beginning as well. So when, I think by establishing these characters the way they are, establishing what their core values are from the beginning, when Dinniman puts them in these situations, there's not a lot of extra work to be done about what they're going to do. Like, the character is established. We know there's only certain ways they will react to a given situation, and that becomes just a lot easier to write. And so a lot of times authors, or this has happened through history, where a writer will say, well, it seemed like I sat down and I dictated the story rather than wrote or came up with the story. And I think a lot of times what this suggests is that the author just had such a clear idea of the characters in their mind that when they put the characters in a situation, they really didn't have to think about how the character was going to respond. The character responded the only way they can respond, through the lens of their flaws and their strengths. And oftentimes they will be driven to respond to a situation in a way that is bad or detrimental to them, but it's the only way they can respond because of who they are. And once you figure that out, like, you get to a place where like everything starts to click and make sense and it's all working, and it's just so much easier to write. But when you have a character triangle like this, and you really understand like your different characters and how they're interacting with each other, that is also so much easier to write. And it becomes so much more fun for the readers, because Carl says something, Donut says something, Mordecai says something. Mordecai responds in the way that he responds, trying to solve problems and the things that he likes. As he comes around to liking them, he's trying to help them, but he also has the leadership of the dungeon hanging over his head, and he always has to be thinking about the dungeon AI watching him, and so he's got to respond in that way. And so all these things start to click and work together. And then there's a bit of a trope of like girding for battle and going out to respond to the dungeon that happens anytime they go into a safe room. And so as these things start to work, it just becomes a lot more fun to read. And then also Dinniman can start messing with them as they, these things, as soon as something becomes comfortable, he can mess with it and change it. So like I said, this book, and each book in the series, and there are 7 books published now, 8 is being written. You can go to, I will just plug Matt Dinniman's Patreon, because the guy is a machine and he is publishing chapters. Like, he's just writing them, and they're, I would say, 80% good to go. I don't know if he hands them off to an editor and then publishes them to the Patreon. It seems like they're just rough enough to make me believe that he's just putting them up there. But I mean, kudos to him, because he really just is getting it done. But each book in the series is a different type of game. And so book 1 is D&D, book 2, like they go into like Pokemon and then card games and then like a train-based game of having to figure out which cars and which trains to get on to solve different parts. That one confused a lot of people. I mean, I admit I really wasn't tracking part of the game world with that. So book 1 is Dungeons and Dragons, or like a dungeon crawler, just like is in the title. And so the characters have to work their way through a series, an underground world that is tunnels and doors and chambers, and you're never quite sure what you're going to come across. And so that is what is pushing the characters to the world. But there is also a ticking time bomb. And so whenever you think about setting up your story, think about external factors that are going to push the characters through the story. And this one is pretty blatant, but it works within the world. So they have a certain number of hours to quote unquote beat the dungeon or get to the exit stairwell without dying, or the dungeon will collapse. And so they're being reminded throughout their time in the dungeon that so many hours to level collapse, so many hours to level collapse. And it's always in the back of their minds, and they can never really relax. They can go into a safe room and try and get some sleep and eat food. And there's even, fun things that Dinniman can do with that. But they're always being driven through the story. They can't just camp out somewhere. And for anybody that plays video games, there's a certain amount of I'll just hang out and grind until, I go from being level 0 to level 100. And then the game isn't quite so hard anymore. But with this mechanic, you can't do that. The character is forced through it. And another piece of what I think makes this series work very well is that my understanding is Dinniman came up writing tabletop games. And so he's obviously spent a lot of time thinking through game mechanics and what makes a game fun, but pushes characters through a game. And when he comes up with all the different so being a D&D type game, or for me, I've played a lot more Skyrim or, Fable, The Witcher, games where they're all about finding loot, and the loot has different attributes that, Fallout, improve your character in certain ways. And so one of the funny things about these games is that people often don't like to play them in a third person view to see their character, because if you do that, you can see how ridiculous your character looks because they're wearing all these mismatched, silly items. But you do that because you want the attributes of the armor and what they have, right? And so that even becomes part of it, where Carl ultimately is wearing a black batwing cape. He has his boxers with hearts on them, his t-shirt. He is ultimately mostly barefoot because, like in a lot of video games, he smushes something in the very beginning, and the AI that controls the game appears to like that and gives him an attribute that when he attacks things or kills things with his feet, it makes him more powerful. So that has the added bonus of being funny, of also providing some interesting character detail about the AI, that it seems to like feet. And I should say this is a comedy, right? While it's very serious in some aspects, it's also very much a comedy. But the characters are always finding these different types of, if it's not armor, it's weapons, it's, clothing, rings, things like that they have to make decisions about, that they then will use in the game. There's what they call buffs, which help them, and debuffs, which could be, you got to make the decision okay, this thing gives me plus 30 attack power, but minus 10 armor. Or even, that's not a great buff. It could be, or debuff, plus 30 minus 60 armor. So that means you got to be a really good swordsperson, because if you get hit, you're going to take a lot of damage, that kind of thing. But one of the mechanics in other games that is a kind of a trope with gamers is loot boxes. And everybody hates the company Electronic Arts, EA, because, and a lot of other companies, because they want to sell these loot boxes. That's how they monetize and make their money. And early on in the game, in the book series, they become less important as things progress, but it's a really big deal to get a loot box because it's got the materials they're going to use to craft items and tools. It's got different things they need to make choices about. But even like starting with the loot box and what loot box to choose, and then what to choose about the items in the loot box. I think that I already write this down. Nope. Let's see. A choice between two equally hard decisions. So the story could always go any different way. Like, it's never fully set. Like, we know how Carl is going to respond. We don't know what the dungeon is going to try and do to him, but he's always being pushed into decisions that could equally go one way or the other. And so that is interesting to read about. And when you do that, that's another way of expressing character through action, because you get to see the character making decisions. They're using their tools and who they are and expressing themselves through decisions they make. And that is what is me as a reader, I love to see. And I think that's really what endears and makes readers, they want to see your characters doing things. So give them things to do. and this is a series that does this constantly. So we have the ticking time bomb pushing our characters to the dungeon. We have lots of choices between equally hard decisions. And then we have boss fights, which is not boss bites, boss fights, which is, you know, a mainstay of video games where you're going to progress through fighting certain monsters until you get to the end of an area or level. In this case, they called them neighborhood bosses. And now you got to really take everything you've learned and figured out and use it against this boss. And one of the tropes in a lot of games, like Zelda does this in particular, is if you know, like, you could just straight up try and fight the boss, which you can do, but, you know, is never the most elegant way to fight the, you know, to play the game. If you figure out the boss's timing, or you figure out, you know, the boss's special weakness, it's a lot easier to kill the boss. And quite honestly, when I grew up, I didn't have a Nintendo. My parents would never buy one for me. I never had a lot of time to just sit and figure out the timing in a game. Man, I'm really dating myself with Nintendo. I mean, I've had every game system from, you know, NES, Super NES, PlayStation 1 to N64. Like, when I had my first real money and went out and bought an N64, even that is totally dating me at this point. I have all these. I've collected a ton of these game systems. I still don't really have a lot of time to sit down and figure out a game. For me, like, probably the biggest game I played in the last few years that had this kind of mechanic was Control. And I still tried to, like, brute force my way through Control and didn't figure out all the ways that make Control, like, a whole lot easier to play, because I was just trying to brute force it. Fallout, I've been playing Fallout for years, and so I know how to play Fallout pretty well. But these are the things, like, certain people just get really good at this, and I never have been. But a game like Elden Ring or Dark Souls, like, that's what those games are all about. Like, you got to figure out each enemy's special attacks, special ways they do things, and that's part of the enjoyment of the game. That is not why I come to video games, but, you know, especially in today's world where, like, people are coming to reading because they want to get away from screens. They're coming to video games necessarily because they want to, like, really focus in on the game. And a game that really forces you to pay attention to what the mechanics of the game are doing gets you into flow state in a certain way. Like, you know, writers understand flow state, like that being a kind of a heightened level of activity when you're doing a thing. It's the same way with playing a game. And I would say it's the same way with reading, when the story just really pulls you in and gets you into that heightened state of, you're not thinking about reading, you're just in the story, following the story. So this is another sort of engine that's kind of driving our characters through this situation, as they know that they're going to be, there's also sort of a game cycle where rest in the safe room, rebuild, regroup, go out into the world, gather resources, get ready, fight the boss battle. That is what's called the gameplay loop in, you know, game design. And it works here in this series very well as far as a way to push characters. Like, no matter where they are in a given scene, you have a a good idea. Like, while you might not know what they're going to do next, you have an idea of like what to expect next. And so you can kind of settle into that and just enjoy it. Now, right off, Dinniman starts subverting that by pulling them into like larger parts of the story. And so expanding scope is the next thing to touch on. And this is the thing that made me think more about Hitchhiker's Guide, because right from the very beginning in Hitchhiker's Guide, you're pulled into this galactic civilization, but that's not readily apparent in Dungeon Crawler Carl that is what's happening. But as soon as they get pulled out of, like, they fight their first neighborhood boss, and then Carl and Donut get pulled out of the dungeon into a talk show and are in this like, what the heck is going on setting of responding to questions about what they're doing. And immediately Carl has to start making decisions about how he's going to respond to this. It's a scenario that is like custom made for Donut, the show cat, because she is like just fundamentally understands how to banter, how to get into people's like try and figure out people so that she can, manipulate them essentially. And then, but that's where she thrives. And so we've been in a situation where one character is obviously overpowered, or I shouldn't say obviously, but that's where his strength lies. And now we pull him into a different situation where another member of the party is the strong one. And so we get to see Donut shine and Carl have to respond to Donut being the strong one. But we also expand the scope of the story. So it went from being, constrained to tunnels and dungeons and the ways that they were fighting there, to now all of a sudden like, oh, we're part of this huge Hunger Games thing. And so, they talk about when you're writing a short story, you're looking at a world through a keyhole. And as you write a novel, now you've got a door that you can walk through the door into the new world. And part of the joy of reading any story is a character's transition from, they go from a point of stasis to a point of tension as their world is thrown out of stasis. They have to respond to the tension, respond to all of that change, make a decision, and have some kind of action that either changes them in some fundamental way, or they don't change and they respond to that fact that they don't change, but they move into a new part of they move out of that story or out of that novel fundamentally different than when they started. And obviously there are examples of books that don't do this, but when you talk about the hero's journey, kind of fundamentally following that, like the hero's journey is a much more straightforward of going from a point of stasis, receiving the call, denying the call, moving into the dark underworld, traveling through the dark underworld with a guide like your Obi-Wan and that sort of thing. And then, coming out of that world, coming back into the world of the light, having changed from, who you were when you first received the call. And then there are variations on that, getting into stereotypes. Like, I just read a book recently, like, the heroine's journey, which basically talked about like not a single inciting event, but a character who sees an accumulation of problems around them and their community to the point where they have to decide to make a change. And then that essentially is them answering the call, moving into the dark underworld of the, Jung like to say that it reflected the psyche and having to move into the self, respond to the self, and then come out of that changed and reintegrated into a new person on the other side of it. And so all of these stories are kind of following that general cycle, like all human stories follow that general cycle. But the expanding scope of that is part of what is the wonder of an adventure story. And so at a fundamental level, Dungeon Crawler Carl is doing the same thing as we start to see that, oh, it's not just the earth, and oh, it's not just this. And also what seem like the bad guys, the mobs in the dungeon, we start to hear them, like we start to see behind the fourth wall a little bit and hear them having conversations outside of the players. And from the very beginning, Mordecai is like an example of a player that was able to get to Like when they get to level 11, they can make a decision about if they want to take a contract and stay and help run the game, or continue in the game and try to get to, I think it's level 13, and get out of the game. Or, I should have this off the top of my head. There's like, I want to say 17 or 18 levels, and nobody's ever gotten them to them before, as far as they know, and beat the game. And so again, we're having to make decisions about what we're going to do. But we start to see that these are not just evil, good or evil bad guys. There are people that have been pulled into the game at different iterations of the game's life and made part of the game. And so everyone is being exploited by the game. And so it goes from what could have been just a very simple, dungeon crawl, basically a very simple one person in a situation, finding loot and using that to solve the problem right in front of them, to a thing that is much bigger. But this isn't given away immediately, but it hints at it. I mean, I'm not spoiling anything by saying this, because this is what they see at this point in the game. Like, they don't understand it, but they see that, whoa, this is bigger than we are. And we're going to have to figure out what to do about this. And as they start to see like how all these other people are caught up in the game, Carl then needs to make decisions about how he's going to respond to all of this. And so it's become a really central line, like it's a theme of the story. It's a central line, idea to fans of this series. And another engine that drives it forward is Carl says throughout, as he's responding to what become very, very heavy decisions increasingly, "You will not break me." And that becomes a core to it, of fighting against a system that is designed to grind you up and dehumanize you and deny the central humanity of all of these other beings, that we are not alone with. "You will not break me" is a thing that he keeps saying. And so that central theme, again, like getting back to the character that drives the characters, like getting back to shouldn't say character, like getting back to the core values that drive the character through the story. As these things start to be set up, like it's not a house of cards. Like, it's a very solid foundation that once these things are set up, I shouldn't say all Dinniman has to do is think up a new scenario for them, but it becomes like we got a pretty good idea how different parts of this story are going to react. But by knowing that, now he can sit back and say, what would flip this? What would, like, I always kind of hate it when a character gets what's called nerfed, which oftentimes you move from being, godlike at the end of one game into the next game. Or often, like, what a game will do is it will open with a whole set piece of you being amazing. And so you can see all the stuff that you'll get at the end of the game, and you like want that stuff because that's awesome. And then something happens where you lose all that power, and now you have to start at level 0, isekai, and work your way back up. That always bugs me when that happens. But shoot, where was I going with this? I just lost my train of thought. But we can see how, subverting the trope. So as we see that the character gets a certain amount of power and it will make decisions in a certain way, you can subvert that. And you're not taking away their power necessarily. You're just putting a twist on it by giving some new information about the world that is not coming out of left field. Like it was there to be found, but also, or giving another character in the party, like the opportunity to shine. All these things kind of keep moving the story forward in a way that is, interesting, and you want to keep going, and you like the characters, and you like the family dynamic that they have built. And the characters could still have secrets to a certain extent, and those things are revealed as they develop their relationships, but they have relationships, and relationships are not cut and dry. They are not, they're messy quite oftentimes, because an easy relationship, while it is, I think the thing that you should strive for in life, for your relationships to be calm and drama free, that's maybe not necessarily the most entertaining of reading, but we do want to see people come together in the end, which is, while tropes are being subverted, characters are acting in their own interest, they still ultimately come together to help solve this problem. And they have opportunities. And that's the last thing I want to touch on, is this is a series that gives people the opportunity to be heroic. And something that is missing, I shouldn't say it's missing, but we've come out of, like, what is it now, 15 years, 20 years of Marvel movies. We've come out of a, like, talking about the hero's journey. There have been a lot of stories where people think, like, maybe it's the literary fiction and the angsty, the idea that everybody needs, like, this really deep internal conflict, or people could obviously have internal conflict, but how they express it toward the outside world can get pretty tedious. And the idea of a hero, like, yes, the world is unfair. Yes, the world has terrible things in it, but people have opportunities to be heroic within those terrible systems. And people can be heroes in the lowest and the smallest of situations, to do a thing that is hard, to stand up for someone that cannot stand up for themselves. Those are heroes. And this is a series that gives people the opportunity to be heroes and does not undermine them. I think Marvel will do this there'll be a fight scene or something, and a character will do something super cool, and then will immediately undercut it with a joke. And it makes it seem like they're just fundamentally not serious people. Like, it lowers the stakes of any given situation because, oh, if they've got time to make jokes, this can't be that bad, right? Like, they might say things that are like, this is going to destroy the world, but they don't react to it in a way that seems like that's really a threat. They don't react in a way that an actual hero would react, like making the hard choice to be a hero, or maybe their character compels them to be a hero in spite of themselves. And once they do, they have the opportunity to be awesome. And this is a series that gives people those opportunities. It really pushes characters to grow in a way that they maybe didn't expect. Like, so Donut has a pet dinosaur named Mongo, and it's kind of the Pokemon trope, right? Of getting an egg. It's absolutely Pokemon. Like, they get an egg and they get the baby dinosaur and they grow the dinosaur. But Donut immediately sees herself as Mongo's parent, the self-centered, narcissist, supposedly, who does care about people, but is still going to react in a narcissistic way to a lot of things, has the opportunity to grow and love something that is not necessarily going to, like, Mongo does love her back. I think that's demonstrated, but Mongo is also a velociraptor. So Mongo is not going to express love in the way that Donut is probably used to receiving praise. But that is an opportunity for Donut to be a hero in a way that she was not before. Like, she has the opportunity to demonstrate love, to grow as a character, and also have a kick-ass velociraptor. So the same thing with other characters. Katya, who becomes a member of their team, and she has her own, like, motherhood is definitely a theme in the story. Parenthood is a theme that each character is probably dealing with and struggling with, ideas of how to be a parent, how to express love towards other people, how we be heroes in those situations, which is really gratifying. Like, another of my favorite characters, Prepotente, who is a humanized goat, and just one of the most awesome characters in the game, that also just randomly goes, goat squeals. But each of these characters has their own opportunity to be a hero and to shine, and you don't have to feel bad about just reveling in their heroism. And that is something that I think this series does really well, and people love to read it. They so often, like, someone will create a central character in genre fiction, I want to say, or, in mainstream fiction, it seems like a lot of people are doing it. A lot of stories do this. And we have to undercut the hero in some way. We have to make them an alcoholic, or give them some, internal struggle that sort of makes them a bad person. And I think that fundamentally this is a series that believes that most people are not bad people. And this is just a fundamental philosophy about the world that there's a book I just read that I wish I could remember the name of it. I'll put it in the show notes if I can find it. But the thesis is that most people are not bad. Most people will do good if they have the opportunity to do good. And while we're steeped in a media environment that wants to make us fear and think that everybody is out to get us and doing bad things, we find in, disaster scenarios and many other scenarios, when people are together and they're not being fed information that is designed to manipulate them, most people are good and good towards each other. And I think that is a central theme of this series, that also you can feel good about reading this series, which is another thing that I think drives people through it. It has built the fandom to really be protective of and to love this series. And it gives people so much to grab onto and feel good about. It's not Game of Thrones, where sometimes when you're talking about Game of Thrones, you almost have to apologize for certain things about it, right? That, yeah, I know these are terrible characters, and yeah, I know they do evil things, but I sure love that Ramsay, even though he flays people. No, you don't have to do that in this series. So that would be the last thing I would touch on is, give people heroes and let them be heroic and don't undermine it. That's a bit of my personal opinion there, but that's something that I just love. And when I look back on stories that I love the most, they just have unapologetic heroes, which is, I think, a thing that everybody can use in today's, fiction that they're trying to escape a little bit. So those are all the engines that I think are working really well in this series. We could also get into the game mechanics. We could also get into, different layers of stories that he's doing. And there's characters, there's things working outside of Carl that he can then touch on at different points in the story that also progress. Everyone is progressing. And that, I think, is just a fundamental mechanic in isekai, progression fantasy, portal fantasy that is being written these days, that is one of those fundamental engines that will drive the reader through the story. Like, no matter what happens, give your character a choice, have them grow within the story, and then give them loot at the end of any given interaction. And I think you'll find that your story is a lot easier to write. And I'm not going to say that this is easy for Matt Dinniman to write, but I think he has absolutely either purposefully or inherently done things that drive this story forward towards what may seem like the inevitable end. But knowing him, and what he has demonstrated so far, I just have so much respect for what he has done. And I don't think that it will be what is expected. So, I think there's a lot to learn as a writer as well from his Patreon and how he kind of communicates with his community and things like that to involve them in what's going on. He's had some really successful Kickstarters. The way the story grew from Royal Road to Kindle Unlimited to iterations on Kindle Unlimited that, built its fan base. And then he was able to sell the hardcover rights to Ace, and what I thought were very expensive hardcovers appear to still be selling very well. Like, there are tentpole books that will pull people into bookstores. And I am not surprised at all that you're going into Barnes and Nobles now and seeing tables devoted to this series, because I can just recommend it unequivocally. For a while, when I first read it, everybody I knew that I was recommending a series to was like, you got to read this. The other thing that I have not touched on is the audio. And Jeff Hayes, who reads the audio, is amazing. He is the best. Actually, I'm just going to make sure, because I'm very certain it's Jeff Hayes. Let's look that up. Yes, Jeff Hayes. So I listened to the audio, and I have switched back and forth between reading it and the audio. This series has the best audio, hands down, of any series I've ever listened to. And the way he does voices, the way he does interactions, like, it is like listening to a movie. And then there is actually, like, there's another thing Dinniman has done well, is that there's extra stuff in the physical books, or I should say the Kindle, like the actual written one, as opposed to the audio. So there are reasons to go look at that. And at this point, I think I've probably bought these books like 3 times. But the audio is just some of the best I've ever heard. Like, absolutely go listen to the sample. They have their own app, which I wish I could. The app has issues, but I love this stuff so much that I'm willing to pay. Like, a lot of audio, you're kind of like, yeah, $15. This is absolutely worth way more than the average Audible. But it's on Audible. It's in Kindle Unlimited. You can buy the Kindle Unlimited book and then get a discount on the audio, and it's amazing. So as soon as I heard this, I was like, oh man, I want to write a book that could get this treatment. Like, that would be a career achievement. So I have since tried to write more lit RPG, and it's not easy. It's not an easy genre to write. It's like romance. People are like, well, I'll just write a romance and make $1 million. Like, no, that's actually pretty hard to do. I have a lot of respect for romance writers. And same thing with lit RPG. I think doing it well is not nearly as easy as people might think it is. So it's all right. Well, I hope this is helpful. And I love talking about books that I love. And I think if you have not read this series, this, I hope, would serve as a review to pull you into it. As a writer, I think there is a lot to learn from this series and a lot to enjoy, both on the story level and on the craft level of just what is happening. Like, as far as how it's put together, how the characters work, how the plot works. So love to hear your thoughts on it. And thank you for hanging out with me. I'll talk to you next time. All right. Later.